Welcome to this month's Courageous Conversation. I'm Neil Dupree with the Diversity Action Team of Rock County and part of the planning team, along with Amy Levy and Carrie Drea of Rock County YWCA and Amy Floan of Community Action of Rock and Walworth County. Diversity Action Team and YWCA are nonpartisan. Community Action is apolitical. Thank you for joining us. This discussion today is about voting. You've got the power to vote, and we'll hear more about voting and the interaction with voting and people of color. If you'd like to be added to our email reminder, please put your email address in the chat room. And we'd like to remind you of the 4 agreements for courageous conversation. Stay engaged, experience discomfort, speak your truth, and expect and accept non-closure. One of the most important things to me there is experience discomfort. If we're ever going to learn or change, we have to be a little bit uncomfortable in the process. The conversation, as you've just heard, is recorded and will be on the YWCA's YouTube channel. Maybe media outlets will be here, and if so, they may record parts of the event. At the end of the program at 7 p.m., the partner members will give announcements, and then after that, all other participants are welcome to give announcements in the last half hour of unmoderated discussion or talk about whatever, ever you want. We would like to recognize that we're meeting on the ancestral lands of Native nations. In Wisconsin, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations and one seeking to regain federal recognition. We acknowledge these indigenous communities who have stewarded the land through the generations, and we pay respect to their elders past and present. And here you go, Amy.
Thank you, Neil. So we have so much to discuss this evening, and we have a guest so excited to be joined by Marcy Granger. So I'm just going to throw our timeline in the chat. We have lots of good videos for you. As always, I'll always put the title and the link in the chat if you want to watch or rewatch or send to a friend or share it in some other way. You are always welcome to do that. But we are going to do a hard stop at 6:30 so that we can save time for our guest, Marcy Granger. We always like to have a local focus to these conversations, what we can do, how we can move forward, next steps. So I have a few questions that I want to ask Marcy, and she is going to share with us what we need to know in order to make sure that all of those around us have the information that they need in order to be registered to vote and have a plan to vote. Definitely make sure that we have that for ourselves as well. And we're going to learn about how to become a poll worker. If that's something you've ever been interested in, but you didn't know what the next steps are, we'll hear that information today. So as always, we're going to get started with some videos to frame our conversation. I will share my screen and get started with the first one, and then I'll put that in the chat shortly after that. But it's how voter intimidation and suppression has evolved since the 15th Amendment. So we'll watch that first video, and then we will pause for discussion and move forward with the evening. So that link is in the chat for your reference, and I'll share my screen and we'll watch.
Voter suppression never went away. It evolved.
They say to me, well, we thought we had done away with poll taxes. We thought we had done away with intimidation. We have all kind of obstacles being placed in our way. It's the same game with a different name.
To understand how we got here, historian Carol Anderson says we first need to understand white rage.
White rage is not how we often think about it. We often think of rage as being this kind of violent backlash or uproar. We know that there's something wrong with the violence that takes down a child. We know that something is wrong with the violence that 6 dogs on nonviolent protesters in Birmingham. We know something's wrong with that. But the kinds of quiet policies that led to that moment, it takes us a long time to recognize the policies themselves are predicated on white supremacy and exclusion.
Anderson says the trigger for white rage is Black advancement. For each advancement Blacks made for voting rights, there was an opposite reaction of white rage. That was the case in Mississippi after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to freed Black men.
Because Mississippi said, how do we write a law saying we don't want Black people to vote without writing a law that says explicitly, we don't want Black people to vote? Because the 15th Amendment said you can't write a law that's that explicit. What Mississippi did was Mississippi said, we will take the societally imposed conditions on African Americans and use those conditions as the access to the ballot box.
Mississippi passed a new state constitution that required every citizen to pay a poll tax, pass a literacy test, and in some cases, meet a property requirement. At the time, Black people were less than 30 years out of slavery when they earned no money and were blocked from reading. The Mississippi Plan of 1890 was applied equally to Black and white voters, but white men could get around the barriers with so-called grandfather clauses. If they or a relative had voted before the Civil War ended, they could skip the poll tax or literacy test. A Mississippi governor later admitted the provisions had no other purpose than to eliminate Blacks from politics. That's how a blueprint to circumvent the 15th Amendment was created, and other states followed Mississippi's lead. In the Jim Crow era, Black voters were often met by violence. Civil rights workers who helped other African Americans to vote were shot, lynched, or violently harassed by vigilantes and police. And even though the 19th Amendment passed in 1920 to give women the right to vote, by 1940, only 3% of eligible African Americans in the South were registered to vote.
The civil rights movement is one of those moments in American history where the U.S. feels a depth of pride because it overcame something as villainous as Jim Crow. And it took a lot of bodies. It took this kind of moral power of the nonviolent movement. It took grassroots organization and mobilizing. It took Martin Luther King, this hard-earned legislative victory of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
The Voting Rights Act was hailed as a defining civil rights legislation of its time. It was especially important because it had an enforcement mechanism the 15th Amendment lacked. Under Sections 4 and 5 of the VRA, states with a history of discriminatory voting laws now needed federal approval or pre-clearance to change their election laws. This gave the Justice Department and federal courts in D.C. power to block discriminatory election laws. Its impact was profound. In Mississippi alone, voter turnout among Blacks increased from 6% in 1964 to 59% in 1969. By then, President Lyndon B. Johnson had established anti-poverty programs to curb inequality. He created Medicare and Medicaid for the elderly and poor and enacted education and housing reforms. By 1966, 85% of whites said the pace of civil rights progress was too fast, and by the 1968 presidential election, white resentment had coalesced into the Southern Strategy.
Southern Strategy, bringing Democrats and disaffected whites into the Republican Party.
The Southern Strategy bolstered racist policies and practices without using racist language. Anderson says this applied to voter suppression as well.
Voter suppression is really based on the Mississippi Plan of 1890, where you can't say we don't want Black people to vote, but that's the intent. That's been a key element in the policy of now the Republican Party. I would say another key element in policy was uttered by Paul Weyrich.
They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down.
to understand the language of voter fraud and voter suppression that's going on now, that's the framework. That our leverage, our power increases when the voting populace is constrained.
When President Ford signed the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1975, the scope of the bill was expanded to protect Latino, Native American, and Asian voters by requiring bilingual elections. Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 1982, 1992, and 2006. The 2006 renewal included 15,000 pages of evidence of ongoing discrimination in voting. Congress said there was progress in eliminating first-generation barriers to voting, but that second-generation barriers had persisted.
Yes, we have made some progress. We have come a distance. We're no longer met with bullwhips, fire hoses, and violence when we attempt to register and vote. But the sad fact is, the sad truth is, discrimination still exists.
Second-generation barriers were laws that diluted the political power of minorities at the polls and included things like racial gerrymandering, poll closures, voter ID laws, and cutting down early voting and same-day voter registration. On a bipartisan basis, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized for 25 years. 2 years later, in 2008, America elected its first Black president.
The election of Barack Obama is one in the latest string of the advancement of Black folk that leads to this incredible white rage.
In 2010, conservative Tea Party candidates swelled within the Republican Party. From 2011 to 2015, 395 new voting restrictions were introduced in 49 states, many of which were struck down by the Department of Justice. Anderson says the election and then re-election of America's first Black president was a factor behind the voting restrictions.
His advancement was the penultimate advancement, and therefore was the penultimate affront. I'm not surprised then that in his second term, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County v. Holder that the Voting Rights Act, particularly Section 4, which was what they called their pre-clearance provision, U.S. Supreme Court gutted that.
The Shelby ruling released 9 states and several counties from federal oversight and pre-clearance in changing their election laws. Southern states reacted swiftly.
2 hours after the Shelby County v. Holder decision, Texas implemented its racist voter ID law.
2 months later, North Carolina enacted HB 589, a bill that required strict photo ID requirements, eliminated same-day voter registration, and limited early voting. The U.S. Court of Appeals later struck down the law, saying that it targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. Since the Shelby ruling, at least 23 states have enacted newly restrictive statewide voter laws, such as voter roll purges, poll closures, and strict voter ID laws. This November, the Republican National Committee and Trump campaign are planning to flood polling locations with poll watchers, claiming to stop widespread voter fraud. A key Trump advisor is heard describing the multi-million-dollar plan in this leaked audio.
Right, traditionally, it's always been Republicans suppressing votes in places. It starts protecting our voters, right? You know where they are there. You know where they are. And they're all in one part of the state, and their voters are all in one part of the state. So let's start playing offense a little bit. And that's what you're going to see in 2020. I think part of it you do. It's going to be a much bigger program, much more aggressive program, a much better funded program. And we're going to need all the help we can get.
Since the passing of Congressman John Lewis, the Senate has come under pressure to approve a bill to restore Voting Rights Act protections struck down by the Supreme Court. When the bill passed the House in 2019, 54 years after Lewis walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, he said this:
"The vote is the most powerful, nonviolent instrument or tool we have in a democratic society, and people should be able to use it."
We understand that the right to vote is foundational and bedrock in democracy. People are asking themselves, how did we get here?
Voter suppression never went away. It evolved. Left unchecked, it will continue to spread.
All right. So before we begin our discussion, just a couple reminders there. That video did include descriptions of specific political parties. But again, that is for information and for a framework for our discussion. And also as a point of reference, that video was created 3 years ago. All right. As always, drop a question mark in the chat if you have reflections or questions from the video that we just watched. That way I'll know who to call on, and you are free to unmute and to share your question or your comment. There was a lot of content in that video, from the Mississippi Plan of 1890 to those specific first generation, as they refer to them, barriers to voting. So things like poll taxes, property ownership, and literacy tests, those apply to everyone. So wasn't racist at face value, but the caveat was, if you had a relative or you yourself were eligible to vote prior to the Civil War, then you were grandfathered in. So that was the around. Lots of things were discussed: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the VRA, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as well as the Southern Strategy. So again, if you want to share a comment or ask a question of the audience, please go ahead and put a question mark in the chat. And then as an obvious reminder, this is Courageous Conversations, which requires conversation. Diane, please go ahead and unmute.
So what can we do here to make sure that all of our voters can get to the polls?
Well, I think that's a great question, and we're going to go into depth with that once we hit the 6:30 mark with Marcy Granger, and all of us can share some ideas of that. Also, a little bit later in the discussion, there is some legislation working its way through the Wisconsin Assembly and Senate, which includes automatic voter registration. So I'll be dropping that in the chat, and also contact information, so you can go to the website. If you're not sure who your representative is, it's very user-friendly. You can go and see who your Assembly and Senate representation are, and reach out and contact them. And if it is your desire to express support or whatever your position is with the bill that's currently working again through the Assembly and the Senate. Other reflections from the video that we watched. Neil, go ahead and unmute.
There we go. Okay. I was just remembering that it was, in terms of voter suppression, that Native Americans were not actually allowed to be citizens until sometime in, what was it, the 30s or 40s, Billy Bob?
He's shaking.
He's nodding his head. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the VRA, that expansion was so critically important to include Latinx folks, Native Americans, and Asians, and the addition of bilingual materials at elections was really critical. So part of the reason that video was selected, Carrie came up with the brilliant graphic for our title this evening, You've Got the Power, Vote for Justice. And so in order to bring home the point of how powerful the vote is, you really have to look at what people went through to obtain the right to vote and how powerful those forces were that met them in opposition to keep them from the vote. No one's going to fight you for something that doesn't have value. And I think, unfortunately, too often we either forget how powerful our vote is, or we simply don't treat it as if it is powerful. But again, no one's going to fight you for something that isn't valuable. All right.
I see a note from Steve Howland. Thank you, Steve. He says everybody should join the League of Women Voters, and that includes men.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to expound on that? If yes, I want to put you on the spot, but if yes, go ahead and unmute. We have a little bit of time.
Simply, there are organizations like the League of Women Voters, which allows virtually everyone and encourages everyone to register and vote, and gets into the issues of whether a homeless person can vote and how that can happen. People with prison records, how they may vote, the whole scope of the issue. So supporting organizations like that, being aware of what's going on, just trying to encourage, as well as participating in activities that allow people who are challenged by transportation issues or other issues like that to vote, to know the rules on absentee ballots and all that other kinds of stuff. Just important to get that information out over and over and over. Thanks.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Steve, with those important reminders. And Diane, just a heads up, you had such a great question. It's simple but powerful. What can we do? And so I think we're going to answer that question in bits and pieces over and over all throughout the discussion. And Steve just gave us a lot of wonderful information that helps to answer Diane's questions. So joining up with groups that are already doing the work, making sure that we're informed, and then not being shy about using our platforms and using our voice to share this information with anyone who will listen. I want everyone who's eligible to vote. Not really my business who you're voting for or what your beliefs and your ideologies are. I want everyone who is eligible to vote to vote. And we saw there in the Southern strategy that they were talking about leveraging power from constricting the voter base. I want the absolute opposite. I want everyone who's eligible to be able to vote, and then we can see what the outcomes are with that. All right. Lisa just dropped in the chat. I'll read it. And Jean, I'm coming right to you. Just in case anyone doesn't have the chat open, I have a document that I will attach on what is needed to get ready to make a plan to vote. Perfect. Lisa, that is absolutely what the chat and this discussion is for. So please, anyone fill the chat with resources. Jean, go ahead.
Amy, I just want to say that I admire and respect the African American population that has fought for so long for this. It's unbelievable to me that there is still this challenge. And I guess that's why I appreciate Courageous Conversations and Diversity Action Team so much. So thank you for bringing this up. I feel very frustrated with our state government because I don't think they listen to our votes, our voices, even though we can be very clear about it. And my second point is I'm wondering if this is going to be part of the change in the curriculum as far as young people learning about the true history of African Americans and America and how we're dealing with this challenge. So thank you, Amy.
No, absolutely. Definitely a team effort with Community Action, YWCA Rock County, and DAT. So grateful for our partners. And I would encourage you to use your frustration as fuel. That is our state capital. Those are our legislators. So if we have valuable opinions that we want to share with them, call them, email them, visit them. Parking is a little pricey, but it's worth it. Schedule appointments, drop in, bring your friends, share your concerns. You may be meeting with their office staff, but that's okay because they talk to their office staff. And I really think that those small acts, if consistent, are really impactful. So use your frustration as fuel. As far as content and educational systems, every district has a teaching and learning department. So feel free to reach out to them and ask questions. What is a part of your curriculum? Do you see that evolving, and why were these decisions made? School districts want to connect with community members, and they welcome those questions and inquiries. Schedule an appointment, send an email. So again, use your power, vote for justice, but use your power to learn about the system and to answer some of these questions that we have as well. All right, so I am going to put the link for our next video in the chat. It's going to talk about voter suppression. Later on in the evening, we're going to talk about gerrymandering. If we have time, I have a clip on voters on the Electoral College and how that structure works. That always fascinates me. If we don't worry, I'll put it in as a chat drop. So I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Every election day, voters have the opportunity to reinvent America. The choices they make shape their households, communities, and even global affairs. It's a tremendous responsibility that was won by the sacrifices of colonial revolutionaries, suffragists, and civil rights activists. But that fight continues to this day. In a healthy democracy, everyone who is eligible to vote should be allowed to do so. Any obstacles, legal or illegal, that prevent voters from exercising that constitutional right is a form of voter suppression. And in the United States, voter suppression has disproportionately impacted minority and disadvantaged communities. While the days of poll taxes, literacy tests, and having to answer questions like how many bubbles are in a bar of soap are over, Americans today face modern tactics that have the same effect of those white supremacist Jim Crow era practices of the past. Elections in the U.S. are administered at the state and county levels. So our elections are a patchwork of rules and regulations that vary depending on where you live. The United States is, however, one of the few democratic countries that requires most of its citizens to opt in to vote, and the result is predictable. Some states have online voter registration. Others allow voters to register by mail. Yet in 2010, at least 51 million voting age Americans were not registered to vote at all. Of that number, 37% were Black and 48% were Hispanic. Erecting hurdles, like requiring voters to prove their citizenship, dictating when a voter can register, and imposing penalties on those organizing voter registration drives hamper civic participation in already marginalized communities. Registering to vote for an election does not necessarily mean you are registered to vote for every election. In fact, state election officials are responsible for periodically updating their state's voter registration lists for things like moving to a new address, name changes, and removing the deceased. Keeping these records up to date is a tall order, leading to 1 in every 8 voter registration records being inaccurate. In some states, these discrepancies have been used to purge minority voters, particularly in former Confederate states with a history of racial discrimination. According to the Brennan Center, approximately 16 million voters were purged between the 2014 midterm election and the 2016 general election, up to 17% of them removed without justification. So let's say you figured out how to register to vote and managed to remain on the list of eligible voters without getting purged. Depending on your state, you may still have to present additional identification when you arrive at the polling station on election day. In the US, more than 21 million citizens have no photo identification. It may be too costly for some, ranging from $75 to $175, while traveling to a government agency to get an ID may be a hardship for others. Nevertheless, 36 states have instituted voter ID laws, which have resulted in an estimated 2 or 3% reduction in voter turnout. In some states, we're talking about tens of thousands of votes, which could be decisive in any given race, from dog catcher to President of the United States. In the 2016 U.S. presidential election, nearly 100 million eligible voters stayed home. Let me repeat, 100 million voters didn't vote. American democracy at the moment is stifled by a mix of voter suppression and voter apathy. There are no quick fixes for the latter, but here are 3 steps that can be taken to help defeat these forms of voter suppression. The first thing the U.S. can do is to create a nationwide system of automatic voter registration. This approach would use interactions we already have with state agencies like the Department of Motor Vehicles to sign people up to vote unless they ask to opt out. 15 states have taken this approach, including populous ones like California and smaller states like Oregon. In the months following the introduction of Oregon's automatic voter registration, there was a 375% increase in new registered voters. If others follow, experts estimate that this solution would add more than 50 million citizens to the voter rolls across the country. Second, the U.S. can expand the number of states who adopt an existing platform, like the Electronic Registration Information Center, also known as ERIC, to maintain the accuracy of its voter list in each state. ERIC cross-references voter registration information with other data collected by agencies like the DMV, Social Security Administration, and the U.S. Postal Service to update voter rolls. This reduces the overall number of errors and removes the justification to conduct wholesale voter purges. 30 states and the District of Columbia have already joined ERIC, and residents of the remaining 20 should encourage their states to follow suit. The third step tries to address voter ID laws. This is a tricky one, since any solution involves legal and legislative processes that rarely come quickly or follow a straight line. It will take pressure and persistence over time to change these laws, but the public has an important role to play. If you live in a state that has strict voter ID requirements, that is a result of state legislators passing laws that demand it. Electing legislators who understand the disproportionate burden voter ID requirements place on minority, rural, and poor voters without actually enhancing the security of our elections is a great place to start. It's worth noting that there have been only 31 cases of voter impersonation, the only thing a voter ID would prevent, since 2000, out of more than 1 billion votes cast. Electing pro-voter representatives, combined with supporting nonprofit organizations who have taken legal action to overturn these suppression tactics, will provide much-needed momentum to this movement. This issue is more than just checking a box in a slip of paper. It is about what kind of country the United States wants to be. The late civil rights icon, Congressman John Lewis, in one of his final speeches, summed it up best. In a democracy, the right to vote is the most powerful non-violent tool we have. Many people marched and protested for the right to vote. Some gave their blood, and others lost their lives. In my heart of hearts, I part of the democratic process. It should not matter if you're Black or white, Latino, Asian, or Native American. We can do better, and we must do better. We have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate to empower all of the American people, not just a select few. We must do what is right, what is fair, and what is just.
All right. So again, Diane, I hope that video continues to answer those questions that you asked us to grapple with after our last video. So much information there. I wasn't even aware of the ERIC system that helped to update the voter rolls. So yeah, always something to learn. I'm scrolling down now because I see that there are new messages. Lisa, thank you for putting that information in the chat. Any comments or reflections from that last video? And again, that link is also in the chat. There's lots of great information there. So if you want to go back and rewatch that or share it, Neil, go ahead and unmute, please.
Is Eric functional in Wisconsin? Does anybody know?
I am not sure. Marcy, are you aware if we are enrolled in the ERIC system?
We are. We use it. So it's a very good system. It helps clean up the files. This is technically kind of our off year because we've only had 2 elections. So after April until the end of the year, many clerks are cleaning up those voter registrations, all of our files, and that ERIC system goes out. So you normally will get those, like they said, if you move or if you haven't voted in a couple of years, it'll say, hey, are you still at this, location? Do you still want to be registered? And you can check and send that back in, and we can continue to keep you registered. Or if you don't respond or you have moved, we take you off the list at that point.
Thank you.
What's the time frame? Do you know from when you would receive that notification? And is it electronic? Is it in the mail? To the time where you need to respond before action is taken?
It is a card that comes in the mail, and it'll say, it'll have our contact information that you have to mail it back to them. And I believe, I don't know the exact time, but I want to say it's at least 30 days that you have to respond to that. But I'll double check. I can look on the WEX website, but I know that there is a time frame. It's not like it's, they give you plenty of time to respond to that. And sometimes they send them out a couple times. And like, if we get them back, sometimes we'll check addresses to see if it was like, in the meantime, they have moved or they have re-registered on there. So, and there are people that are taken off there because they've either passed away, they have moved out of the county, they have moved out of, that municipality. It's not always a bad thing that you always hear that, oh, they took thousands of voters off. In Wisconsin, I'm only speaking for Wisconsin, there's very strict guidelines to how you do that, and WEC oversees that also.
Now, what is WEC? I'm not familiar with
That's okay. It's Wisconsin Elections Commission. So right now we are kind of in flux. There's debate about whether or not they have the ability to tell us what to do. They're kind of fighting. I'm sure you've heard of Megan Wolf. She is in charge, but they won't confirm or fire her, I guess is the best way to put it. So she's leading without really not leading, and moving into next year, it's going to be kind of a battle. And then, because some states, their Secretary of State is in charge of the elections, where we have the Wisconsin Election Commission, where it used to be called GAB, Government Accountability Board. So that's kind of where we go and where our county clerks go for direction on certain items, certain things.
Perfect.
So,
that's a good information. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So what I am putting in the chat now, there are 2 bills working their way through the state assembly and Senate. It's Assembly Bill 605 and Senate Bill 561. And they have a lot of joint language. So I'm just going to place this in the chat. It's language that's found in both of those bills. And if you don't have your chat open, don't worry, it's brief. And I'll read it. And then you can click those links if you want the PDF of the language in each of those bills. So the joint language found in both reads, this bill requires the Elections Commission to use all feasible means to facilitate the registration of all eligible electors of the state and maintain the registration of all eligible electors for so long as the elector remains eligible, except as the law specifically requires electors to take some action to continue their registration. So basically this would work with the DMV to do automatic voter registration. And you do have the ability to opt out. So this is another thing. If you have strong opinions on this, let me put another item in the chat. So there are two items I'm going to place in the chat. The first is Wisconsin State Assembly home, and then Wisconsin State Senate home. And you can use either of those links to pull up very easily the contact information for your Assembly and State Senate representation, and communicate with them and let them know your opinions on both of those bills that are working their way, again, through the Assembly and the Senate. Any comments or if anyone is already familiar with those bills, anything you'd like to share with the audience? Neil, go ahead.
This is not directly related to what you're saying, Amy, but in terms of getting people to vote, it's really important for people to feel like it makes a difference if they vote. And so as we interact with friends, neighbors, family, it's important for us to reaffirm that voting can make a difference, and to have some examples at our fingertips, I suppose, too, but also to listen to why people aren't interested in voting and deal with them as on their own terms.
Absolutely. Those are important reminders. So one example I have in my kind of anecdotal information is the more local the election, the greater impact each vote has. I think it was a couple cycles ago, local school board race, I think it was separated by 11 votes. Like, you can't get more every vote is urgent than to be separated by 11 votes. And I would say, with my experience with canvassing, don't shame people. If you come across someone who has never voted or is an infrequent voter, shame should not be in your toolkit or judging them, because that's just going to turn people away from the process also. So resist and just share them information that they need to know in order to become a registered voter, or to check their eligibility to vote, to see if they're still on the rolls. Just give people good information and let them make decisions from there. Anyone else before we shift? So fun fact about me, this is a fun fact, but interesting fact, I didn't see the big deal with voter ID. I was like, you have an ID, you take it to the poll, no big deal. Wow, the more I dug into it, I'm like, oh, okay. And they kind of alluded to it in one of the previous videos, that the only thing that presenting a voter ID does, and anyone jump in if you have a differing opinion, is prevents people like imposters. Like, someone goes to the vote and says they're Amy Joyce Levy and they want to cast their vote. That is the only type of voter fraud that the voter ID prevents. That made me kind of think, let's think if we need this or if we don't need this. So we have a video coming up next that's going to talk about, the title is "Do Voter ID Laws Burden Voters?" So we'll watch that, and then we'll have a discussion about it. So I'll put that in the link in the chat first. And I'll share my screen.
ID laws have become somewhat controversial over the last couple of decades because for a while states didn't have very many of them or didn't enforce them as strictly. But nowadays, many states have enacted newer voter ID laws, many which require photo identification, many of which are strictly enforced.
These laws are controversial because, on the one hand, proponents claim that they're needed in order to prevent fraud. On the other hand, opponents argue that they will keep some people from voting, since a substantial portion of the population doesn't have ID, and will have an especially negative effect on participation by racial minorities and people who are poor.
There's been a lot of litigation about voter identification laws and whether or not they're discriminatory. And for the most part, the courts have been mixed. They look at the particular jurisdiction, They look at the kinds of identification that are available to voters. They look at whether or not it's a strict or non-strict regime, whether it's a photo or non-photo regime. And depending on the evidence, what political science there is or what the recent electoral history is, courts have come out on both sides of the question. In some circumstances saying that the voter identification laws aren't discriminatory. In other places say they place too great a burden on certain populations of the public or maybe the voter public as a whole.
It's generally the more severe or strict voter identification laws that get challenged in courts. Those are laws likely to exclude more people, obviously. The stricter the identification requirement, the more likely it is that some people won't have it and therefore will be burdened or disabled from voting.
On the one hand, we want to have secure elections. We want to prevent voter fraud. At the same time, we recognize that they can be barriers to access for those who lack an appropriate form of identification that might be turned away from the polls on election day. On the whole, these voter identification laws do little to burden voters, and therefore it's a reason why the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision in Crawford, concluded that these laws do pass constitutional muster.
Even if they don't explicitly prevent certain groups of people from voting, like poor people or racial minorities or felons, if a law imposes a significant burden on voting, the state should have to come up with a strong justification for such a law.
States have an interest in ensuring that elections are conducted with integrity. They want to prevent voter fraud, and they want to make sure that the public feels confident that when they cast a vote, their vote is meaningful and it's going to be effectively cast and counted at the end of the day.
The incidence of voter impersonation fraud, the only kind of fraud that a voter ID law is really going to prevent, is vanishingly small. If you look at where voter fraud actually occurs in real life, now it's not common in any form, but it most commonly occurs with absentee ballots. A voter identification law, which requires people to present photo ID or something like it when they go to the polls, it's not going to do anything about people submitting absentee ballots on behalf of other people who are really actual people or who didn't really vote their absentee ballots the way they've been marked.
Voter identification addresses a fairly narrow and what I think is uncommon form of voter fraud, which is in-person voting fraud. Somebody who shows up at the polling place saying, I'm John Smith, when they're not John Smith and trying to cast a vote on their behalf. There are greater problems when it comes to addressing voter fraud. One is poll worker fraud. Poll workers who fraudulently cast ballots after the polls are closed, or who destroy or alter ballots in the counting process before they're delivered.
The best argument that I've heard is the so-called broken windows argument that, yeah, even if voter ID isn't really going to do much to prevent fraud, having a voter identification law and tightening things up around the polling place will prevent sloppiness and some of the shady practices that might go along with it.
The best argument in favor of a voter identification law is that it's a common sense and simple way of preventing voter fraud. It might not protect all kinds of voter fraud. It might require a little bit of a burden from voters to make sure that they have the right forms of identification. But so far, it seems to have negligible, if any, impact on elections.
I think the best argument against the strictest voter ID laws is that we don't need them and they're going to keep at least some people from voting. We have this idea that I think people across the ideological spectrum in the United States of America believe that every eligible citizen should be able to cast their vote, that the right to vote is really important to our democracy.
We want the appearance of fairness, and that's an important aspect of the voter identification law, that it shows that everybody is required to show it. Everybody has a very tangible reminder when they show up to the polling place that there is an accountability procedure that's occurring, and it helps ensure the integrity of the election process.
All right, what do we think? Are you for or are you against? I'm curious.
I just want to add, in the state of Wisconsin, for an absentee ballot, you have to provide a photo ID. The only way you don't is if you are indefinitely confined. So if you're a normal voter, if you're wanting to vote absentee, to request that by mail, you have to provide that photo ID.
Now that's the upload process, because I've done that before. Why would you not need a vote? Okay, so since we have voter ID laws, why would you not need a voter ID simply because you are indefinitely confined?
It's kind of how the law was set back. People thought absentee voting just kind of happened, but it's been going on for years. And previously, that was the only way you could vote. Like, you literally had to show a doctor's note or itinerary from your vacation of why you needed that absentee ballot, where now you don't. And that was the big fight. The last presidential election is everybody kind of found out that you didn't have to provide a photo ID. So they would say that they're indefinitely confined. And you can't deny that. You can't question that from a person. So that's where this ERIC kind of comes. We've kind of done some cleanup on the back end, like stating, are you truly indefinitely confined? Did you mean to check that this is the definition of it? But you still can't question whether they are or not. But that is the only, so it's for, you know, your elderly neighbor down the street that doesn't have a smartphone, doesn't have a computer, can't leave her home, could apply, you know, for that. They can mail in the application, they can do it online, they can have somebody, you know, come into the office to do that also. But that's the only time that you would not need a photo ID to request an absentee ballot. To register in Wisconsin, you do not need a photo ID. The only thing you need a photo ID for is to vote and to request an absentee ballot. To register, you do not need a photo ID. You need a proof of residency, and that's not a photo ID. That's to prove where you live, where most people, that's their ID, their driver's license. The state of Wisconsin, the DMV, will give you a free photo ID. You can go there and they will do that. If you don't have a driver's license, they'll give you just an ID just for the voting purposes. But there's a list of things that you can use to register, and it's not a photo ID.
Steve, back to your point, that is one thing that Lisa Johnson taught me. Hopefully I'll make her proud. In order to register, you have to prove where you live. And in order to vote, you have to prove who you are. Hopefully I got that straight. Where are others on, are you, yes, we should have voter ID? No, we don't need it. Steve, go ahead.
I think the argument for it is fairly weak, as was presented in the presentation. There are any number of people, if the previous information was correct, in terms of 50 million people in the country that aren't registered, and how many don't have photo IDs. It's a hassle. A lot of times, if you're going to vote, you leave things off until the last minute. You show up, you're told you have to have a photo ID, you feel disenfranchised. It's not a way of enfranchising people. So I think the arguments for are fairly weak. How do you maintain election integrity? There may be better ways. And a compulsory thing that some states have embraced might be a better way of doing it.
All right, Steve, thank you for sharing. We have time for a couple more if others want to share before we shift gears. I'm excited to see gerrymandering coming up in the chat. That is actually the topic of our next video. It's gerrymandering is geometry silencing your vote. So if you want to understand about geometry silencing your vote, we have that coming up in the next video. But before we get that, does anyone else want to share their opinion? Oh, Nancy, I see your hand is raised. Go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. As somebody who's worked at the polls for over 20 years, I've seen it both ways. And I would say that the voter ID, I agree with all the things that Steve just said. But I'd like to add that I think if people are concerned about fraud and they want to improve the integrity of the election, the best way to do that is to be sure that the poll workers are well trained. And I think in Rock County that happens, but I don't know that it happens everywhere. But I think maybe Lisa Johnson has more information on this than to add, but that when there have been problems with voting and things not being counted properly, it wasn't because people had bad intentions, it was because they didn't know what they were doing. So training is really important part, and we don't talk about that. So that's it.
Well, we are going to talk about it tonight. So thank you for that beautiful segue. I'm going to squeeze in one more video about gerrymandering because I found it fascinating. Hopefully you will too. And then I'm going to yield the floor to Marcy. I have 3 questions that I'm going to be greedy and get in first. And then I'm going to open the floor. So think about the questions that you have for Marcy. So we'll go to the video and then we'll come back.
Fair elections, the cornerstone of American democracy. Psych. Let me tell you why that's a load of malarkey. We've been told over and over again that every vote counts. Like when those cool celebrities tell you to go out and rock the vote. When it comes to electing your representatives, you know, those people that write the laws, there are cases when your vote doesn't really count. And that's no accident. Politicians do it on purpose. It's called gerrymandering, the age-old art of rigging the system. Politicians use population and voting data to create new voting districts so that their party has a better chance of winning the most districts overall. Like in this case, where blue wins 3 out of 5 districts, even though there are fewer blue voters than red voters. Both Democrats and Republicans gerrymander. It's probably the reason why in the 2016 elections, Democrats won 47% of the vote for North Carolina's House seats, but only ended up with 23% of the seats. This isn't just a North Carolina problem. It happens all over the map, and people are starting to get mad.
Gerrymandering has created an absurd reality.
Gerrymandering is vote rigging.
That is voter fraud.
That is real voter
gerrymandering.
fraud. So what is gerrymandering? And what can we do to stop it? Well, gerrymandering is all kinds of complicated, but it boils down to some of my favorite things: data, geography, and geometry. Every state is split into districts. You've got congressional districts where each district gets 1 rep in the U.S. House of Representatives. Every 10 years, states redraw the district lines to account for people moving and other population changes. There are 2 big rules that govern how we draw district lines. Number 1, districts have to have the same number of people. And number 2, thanks to the Voting Rights Act, districts can't be racist, which means you can't clump all the people of color into one district or spread them out so much that their vote doesn't mean anything. Just to be clear here, racial gerrymandering is not allowed, but political gerrymandering, that's okay. Mathematically, there are like a gazillion ways that you can split a state into districts. Each state has its own process for drawing these lines, and most are done by lawmakers, aka the politicians in power. With the help of computer programs, politicians use population and voter data to make predictions about how different geographical arrangements will likely vote. If they want to guarantee their party stays in power, they can just divide up the districts to squeeze out the other party, pretty much just negating the opposition's votes. It's the reason you get districts that look like a praying mantis or an upside-down elephant. When this happens, you can end up with districts that are mostly made up of one party. So it's really hard to vote elected officials out of office. The opposing party just can't win. Time for a demonstration. Jerry, bring out the whiteboard. So Jerry's brought out my handy little whiteboard here. But first, let me get my teaching glasses and hat ready for you guys. All right. So, class, what we have here is a city district. These squares represent, we'll say, Republicans, and these circles represent the Democrats. Now, the Democrats want to crack the Republican vote. They would just do it like this. Okay, so you have this little line right here, little line right there, little line like that. And see, what we have here is they've diluted the Republican vote and absorbed it into the Democratic vote. So the Democrats would win each of those districts. That's called cracking. And you also have something that's called packing. Now, packing varies from cracking because with cracking, what we did was we broke it down. Packing, we're gonna clump it in. Maybe do a little something like that, then come back up, and then voila, right? So what we've done is we've sacrificed this one district all for the sake of these other districts. You see what I'm saying? Now you have a greater chance of getting districts all around the one in the middle. So this is what politicians are doing to dilute votes from various communities around the country. And there you have it, cracking and packing. You just learned something. So what can we do to confront this affront to democracy? Well, here's a couple of ideas. One is take the humans out of the process entirely and leave it up to computers. We can write computer algorithms that ignore political data and draw district lines based on population size in neat and tidy shapes. None of this praying mantis nonsense. But not everyone's sold on this idea. How can we make sure that these districts are actually more fair or that they don't violate the Voting Rights Act? Another solution is to take redistricting out of the hands of the politicians and give the power to the people. A few states, like California, have independent commissions in charge of redistricting. These bipartisan groups don't have any incentive to gerrymander. This is actually how most other Western democracies do it. But all in all, it's still a struggle to determine how to draw lines that are the most fair. And now, we want to hear from you. How does the practice of gerrymandering make you feel about casting a ballot in the future? What else do you want to know about this? Let us know in the comments below. And
all right, so hopefully that video was helpful. I had never heard of cracking or packing. I had heard of gerrymandering. So hopefully you're learning something new at Courageous Conversations. We are a couple minutes behind, so I do want to yield the floor to Marcy, and I have a few questions. That is the link for the video. I just dropped that in the chat. But anyone, are there any quick reflections that you would like to share from that video? Go ahead while I put our next questions in the chat. All right, here we go. So I asked Marcy before this evening's discussion 3 questions. So I'll read those if anyone doesn't have their chat open. And then while she is responding to those and giving us some great information, think about any questions that you have for her, because this is a great opportunity to get some of those questions answered. So first question, how are polling locations decided? Second question, what information do we need in order to encourage others to register to vote? Some of that we've gone over, but if there are other things Marcy wants to make us aware of, please don't hesitate to share those. And then my last question is, how can we become poll workers? So Marcy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So the polling locations are decided by ordinance by the city government, at least in the city of Beloit. So they can either change them, alter them, combine them. Sometimes we actually have it on the agenda for the next meeting, polling locations. So it's done by the government. Us as staff present kind of what our opinions are, and then it's ultimately council's decision on that for those polling locations. And there are certain requirements to become a polling location, and we do have to submit those to the Wisconsin Elections Commission. There's lots of things that have to be done to be that polling location. Is there any questions on polling locations?
I have a follow-up, but I don't want to be super greedy. So if anyone has questions for that first question, you go right ahead. All right, I'll jump in. So I'm a parent and my kids are a little bit older, but it always made me kind of do a double take with using schools as polling locations, because I don't want a whole bunch of people that I don't know in my kid's school.
So that's great. Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off, but that is that's why it's on the agenda. We met, some city staff met with Dr. Garrison and some school officials, and we decided together we will not be using the elementary schools for 2024. So that is what's on the agenda for December 4th meeting. We've kind of done some workshops. We did workshops with the League of Women Voters, with NAACP, with La Voz de Beloit. We've met with the college. We've kind of met with council. But as a group, because of the reconfiguration and the safety issue, it's just not a safe option for us to be in those schools next year. So we won't be in those. So where we end up is kind of ultimately up to council. And then we definitely have a communications kind of package set so we can do like weekly updates so people know where they're going to vote next year when that does happen.
Oh, okay. All right. So breaking news. I had no idea Marcy's response before this evening. While I feel kind of selfish saying that, because I do want polling locations to be centrally located and easily accessible. So I'm hopeful that those items and concerns are going to be a part of the upcoming conversation.
Yeah, and it definitely is a safety issue, and even just parking at some of the schools that we were using on top of the school safety and room, basically. We want it to be a positive experience for the voter and the election workers. That's kind of our motto this year. So that's what we're trying to find, kind of the best of both worlds there for that.
All right. So what information that we haven't already discussed do we need to know in order to have a personal plan to vote, to encourage others to create a personal plan to vote? What are we missing?
Well, I think a lot, the League of Women Voters is very great, and we've been working together. And I think someone had said that it's just kind of the unknown, but I want to throw this statistic out there. So in the city of Beloit, we have, I believe it's 15,675 registered voters. We never even have half of them vote. So registration is really, the new voters, people that haven't voted, we need them to register, but we need people to show up at the polls. That's a huge, huge thing in Beloit, that we have under 50% of the people that are already registered to even come vote. So we have been meeting with groups, like I said, and I have been working with Sherry Pounds. I am going to go to the next NAACP meeting. We're going to start going to churches to try to get people registered to vote, to explain where they have to vote, how they have to vote. And we're going to try to do the Souls to the Polls next year for April and November. So that's a Sunday that everybody will go to church, and then either before church or after church vote. And we will be open on the weekend for absentee voting. And that can only happen the first weekend of absentee voting. But we're going to kind of work together to have that happen, to see if, we can get people to vote there. The absentee voting is a big controversial thing, but it is an excellent resource for people. It's almost 2 weeks at City Hall that people can take the bus if they don't have transportation. Side note, we have been working with transit to offer free busing on election days. So we're working on that for next year also. But then, you can come in, if you have the smartphone, if you have the computer, you can order the ballot right to your house. You don't have to leave. But I think just the biggest misconception, and it's going to be really bad next year, is special interest groups will mail out voter registration forms. They put our return address on them. They are not from us, but it makes the voter think they are. Then there's also confusion that they think that's an absentee ballot request, which it's not. So kind of getting that information out there to either go to My Vote, to come to the clerk's office, to go to Wisconsin Elections Commission, to make sure that they have the right information for registering. Because we will always send out letters if they don't have the information that we need from those special interests. We've actually been contacted by a couple of them and had conversations that it confuses people more than it helps get people registering. And then just, knowledge, going to the websites, calling the clerk's office, calling the county clerk. There's, multiple ways that you can get a hold of people to try to figure out where you have to vote. In Wisconsin, we're lucky you can register the date of the election. It's not like that in every state. You just got to know what you have to be able to do that.
And special thank you to the county clerks across the county. Mm-hmm. A few years ago, YWCA Rock County put out a piece on our website, and Angela's like, Amy, contact all the county clerks and make sure all of this is accurate. And I'm like, okay. So as I'm calling, I was so surprised. A lot of the county, well, not a lot, but I'll say more often than not, they were like, put down my cell number. And I'm like, no. We're going to put this on our website. And they're like, that's fine. If someone has a question about voting, they can call my. I was like, oh, okay. So my experience is that county clerks across the county really have gone above and beyond to make sure that people have the correct and accurate information to vote. And I just thought that was so great.
Yeah, we're lucky in Rock County. Lisa is amazing, and she will talk to anybody at any hour of the day if you have a question and explain it. And if she doesn't know, she will find out and get back to you very timely. So
that's awesome. Very important.
Yeah.
Before we go to our final topic with Marcy about how we can become a poll worker, are there other questions on either something that's already been asked, you want more information on, you have a brand new question? The floor is open. Yeah, Steve, go ahead and unmute, please.
Same-day registration is available in Wisconsin. What are the items somebody would have to bring?
So if you're going to register and vote that day, you're going to need your proof of residency, which does not have to be the photo ID. There's a list of items that you can bring for proof of residency, but then you will need that photo ID to turn around and then vote that day. We have been kind of like making little cheat sheets of like voter registration versus photo ID, so people kind of know that. And then the DMV is they will do free IDs. So if someone doesn't know, and the other thing is you have to live in that community at least 28 days before that election. Otherwise, you revert back to your previous municipality to vote. But like to register to vote, your photo ID, your driver's license, you can bring your real estate bill in, you can bring in your electric bill, you can bring in your water utility bill from the city of Beloit, a paycheck stub, government documents. The list has really expanded the last couple years, like your lease. There's like government issues. So even like a DNR, like hunting permit, we can take those as your proof of residency. And like you had said, Amy, it's proof of where you live. So we make sure you are voting in the correct area where you need to be. And you have to have lived there for at least 28 days before that election.
For the DMV, do you need an appointment to get a photo ID, and how long does that take?
Because now they don't, they do like a paper copy first. I believe, let me see. I think you can go online or go there. I'll have to check into that. I don't know if it's an online issue. I just know that they don't charge for the photo IDs either. Because they
do you have to specify that it's for voting in order to get it? Right?
Yeah. Yep. And there is a little cheat sheet that I'll try to find and I'll forward it to you, Amy, that you can share that kind of it breaks that down, that photo ID that is offered free.
Sounds good. And I'll just email it out to participants.
Yeah.
Perfect. It looks like a lot of activity is going on in the chat. So if you're able, open that and make sure you're getting caught up. So if we've ever thought about being a poll worker but have never done it, that would be me. What do we need to know?
So you have to be a U.S. citizen. You cannot be on the ballot. You can't work an election that you're on the ballot. That's a big one. You can be 18 years old. There's some instances that you can be a high school student, but that's kind of a whole other caveat. You have to have certain grade points. The parents have to sign off. The school has to sign off. So you have to be a resident of Rock County to work in the city of Beloit. You don't have to live in the municipality to be an election worker anymore. Previously you had to, but to be a chief inspector, you do have to live in that municipality. There are special, like if we're running out of chiefs, we can kind of deputize somebody that does not live in the city of Beloit if it came down to it to be a chief. That's kind of our issue lately is we have poll workers, we don't have chief inspectors. Some have been doing it for a long time, are retiring. Some don't like the environment of elections lately. There's a lot of issues and it's not just us, it's kind of everywhere in the state. The chief inspectors are kind of done working and trying to get those new people trained and knowing what they need to know to be in, because they're in charge of the polling locations, those, the day of the election. You have to be able to vote. So like you can't be convicted of a felony. You have to read and write. It's a long day, 6 a.m. to sometimes 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night. You have to be available in Beloit at least to work at any polling location. We do have a thing where you can put where you prefer to work, but we try to we have several that we have to staff. And then we do have trainings. for the poll workers for the elections. Right now, we're kind of waiting to see if we will have a February election, because we will only have a February election for school board and city council if the more, more people run. If we don't, then we won't have that election, and then we'll kind of have more time to get lots of training in. So we will usually do like a quick training, a lot of times via Zoom before that February, and then kind of add to it as the year goes on. And Wisconsin Elections Commission has a lot of training videos. Also, we have them on our website. We have a lot of things linked on our website to be a poll worker, questions asked about it. We kind of welcome anybody, but just know that it is a long day. But I feel that it's very rewarding, but not everybody feels that way. So.
Do you have to commit to the entire day, or can you work a shift?
We have started, it's easier in one hand to have everybody work all day, but we know that's just not realistic for most people. So we do have like a morning shift and an afternoon shift. And I believe the morning one goes from 6 a.m. to like 2, and then the afternoon one kind of overlays till the end of the night. If we, like if you can only work a couple hours, we'll kind of take what we can get. And then we do also have like a pool of people, because there's always somebody that's sick, stuff comes up that they can't come in, and we can call you at the last minute and say, hey, can you run to the library? And so we kind of do have all that. So
all right, I want to get to a couple questions in the chat. Nancy, I'm coming to you. Let me make sure I'm starting at the top. Can you explain when a felon may vote in Wisconsin?
So we had this question somewhere else. We did some question and answering, and I actually called Lisa Tolson in the middle of the night. So if you are a felon in the state of Wisconsin, but you get released or get expunged from your conviction, you will get paperwork from the Department of Corrections to fill out to be able to gain that back. But it has to come from them to get those papers from them to do it. And you can vote, but you cannot be an election worker. You can be a greeter. And we're trying to figure out where that started and how that started. Not being able to be the election worker for that felon. There's kind of, sorry.
No, that was the next question. Are ex-felons who are off paper allowed to be poll workers?
Right now, they can be greeters. We're trying to get clarification. I believe Lisa reached out to the Wisconsin Elections Commission. We're trying to get clarification of if they have that expungement and they went through the Department of Corrections and they have all of that. We're just kind of waiting. We've never in Rock County, at least where I have been in a couple different places in Rock County, had anybody ever want to work the election from that. So, but they're going to try to get clarification of that. So if there is somebody that wants to do that, what they can do and how they can do that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Nancy, please go ahead and unmute.
I was just going to add that Janesville also allows part-time poll workers or half-day workers, as she alluded to, for Beloit. And speaking as somebody who's done it a long time, I have a lot of experience, but I cannot handle that length of that day anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm happy that to do even 3/4 of a day, but 6 until we're done counting at night is just too much for an octogenarian.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And I have not since I've been in the city of Beloit, but a previous municipality where I was at, we actually even had a crew that would come in at the end of the night just to do the counting. But that's when you only have one polling location. So it's kind of, so we are adapting and having people work half day, kind of what they can work. And then there are the people that will work the whole day. So
yeah, go ahead and unmute, please.
There we go. Oh, my question is, do poll workers get paid?
They do. They don't get paid nearly enough of what they should, but they do get paid. There's like they'll get paid for training, they get paid for setup. Chief inspectors will help because we have to set up the polling locations on Monday before the election on Tuesday. And then there's pay for that day. There is a lot of them, I shouldn't say a lot of them, there are a group of them that volunteer their time that don't take that pay, but yes, you do get paid for working. The average like poll worker, if they work the whole day, it's like 130, and then training is 20.
Great question. Does the city or other municipalities, have you considered working with employers? Several lifetimes ago when I worked for Limited Brand, we could convert, and I think we could do it 2 or 3 times a year, a day of work for a day of service. So has there been any partnership with employers to, instead of coming to work that day, you can work at the, your local election?
I have not seen it yet in Beloit. I know COVID era, there was a lot of county workers that could do that. And they kind of spread the county workers out throughout the municipality or the county of people that needed workers through the COVID era. But I have not in Beloit been contacted by anybody to do that as of yet.
Would you be open to partnerships like that?
Oh, for sure, for sure. And we do, we've been asked a couple times by election workers to write letters because their employers would not let them off and they legally have to. So we have provided those letters for those people.
And that's time off so that they can cast their ballot, not to work.
No, so, well, yes, so they can cast their ballot plus work. Like if you want to be an election worker, they have to give you the day off to do that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So, yeah, so we'll write them a letter saying, yes, they're going to be, the poll worker, this is when they're working and, where they're working. So, and most of them are very good about it. So.
All right.
But yes, they're supposed to give you time off to vote also. So.
Okay. Sounds good. Nancy, your hand is still raised. Is that intentional? No? Okay. All right. I'm going to ask for audience participation. I have one more 5-minute video that's on the Electoral College. I can just drop that in the chat if there are additional questions. So up to you all.
I know someone asked about the firearms. You cannot have firearms at the polling locations.
That's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And you also cannot electioneer at the polling place.
Right, right. A lot of, so I know there was, I can't remember which election it was, but there was a sign that was near a polling location. It has to be at least 150 feet from the front door of that. So we did get some calls about that. Some days, I'm kind of a lot of times people will like wear a hat in just to kind of see how riled they can make you. So unless someone is uncomfortable and comes to an election worker and says, I would like them to remove that hat, we kind of ignore because they're looking for a response from you. If you don't give it, they just vote and out the door they go. So.
Good to know.
We've been lucky in the city of Beloit, knock on wood. So.
Diane, I see your question mark. Please go ahead and unmute.
Is Rock County the Rock County DMV, is that the only one that does free ID photos? I mean, did they do that in all the counties of Wisconsin?
I think it might be a statewide thing. And I will definitely look for that pamphlet and share it with you so you can share it with everybody because it kind of states, Lisa makes sure that we put them out everywhere so everybody knows that because I know the ID is a big thing. So Lisa from the county is a big proponent of that pamphlet being kind of everywhere. We start putting them out months before the election so people can see that.
Wouldn't it be nice if they did that all over the United States?
Yeah, and people need the biggest misconception and the biggest message that I put out there. Every state has different election laws. So I always tell people when they'll call me and, well, the TV said, I'm like, turn your TV off. because the TV is not always right and every state is different. So you need to check into your state. What is the law? And because we are so close to Illinois, to, you know, Minnesota, to all of those, we just, you always focus on Wisconsin and in Rock County, in the city of Beloit. You know, this is kind of our laws and this is what we can do. Because that's a big confusion. People, you know, like November, we didn't have an election. We had people show up trying to vote or calling and wanting to vote because they hear it on the TV or they read it about, you know, something. So it's very much, you know, be aware of where you live and what's going on in your community, not the whole big. And in the world of social media, it's great in one hand, and on the other hand, it does cause some confusion for people.
All right. Wow. You all made me a little nervous in the beginning because there weren't that many questions, but you came through in the end. So I am very grateful. We're going to begin to wrap up and do announcements from our partner organizations, and then Neil will transition us into the parking lot, which is, if you're not familiar, is a continuation of the conversation if we need it for another 30 minutes, but it's unmoderated, unrecorded. It's very laid back and go with the flow. All right. I just have one announcement, but it's a big announcement. Next year's, which sounds crazy saying, but next year, 2024, the MLK commemoration, I'm putting the PDF flyer in the chat, so go ahead and click on that when you have a moment. We're back in person again. We're going to be at Blackhawk Technical College on Saturday, January 13th from 2 to 4. Our intention this year is to highlight students from across Rock County. So we are reaching out all across the county. We want to get as many young folks involved as possible. This year's theme, life's most persistent and urgent question, is what are you doing for others? So hopefully, everyone in this meeting, and you're going to bring lots of friends and family with you, Saturday, January 13th, 2024, in the newly renovated conference center at Blackhawk Technical College from 2 to 4 p.m. You don't want to miss it, but if there's a mobility issue, we are notorious for having terrible weather during that weekend. JATV is going to be recording, and they will re-air once everything is polished. But we would love to see you in person, and we'll have conversation, refreshments after. So hoping many, if not all of you, can join us. Neil, what's going on at DAT that we need to be aware
of? I just want to ask, are you going to say anything about tomorrow night for the people who attended the conference?
I wasn't going to, but I absolutely can. So if you participated in our racial justice conference, we're testing the waters because we're building out our conference for next year, our 10th annual. We're so excited. We're going to start planning for each of you in January. We are having, for anyone who participated in the conference, an in-person post-conference session. We are going to be digging into Dr. Mark Joseph's anti-racism framework, so the racial justice versus racial equity. So I'm excited to dig into that. We're going to be at the DWRC tomorrow from 6 to 7:30. So come out and join us. We will have light refreshments. We are asking that you bring a reusable bottle and fill that up with water and join us for a great conversation. And we are going to be doing some work. It is going to be a working session. So say we didn't warn you. We are going to be sharing ideas, talking about next steps. What can we do to put this information in action? So come prepared to work.
Okay. Jean, are you still on? I think you still are. But I believe that the DAT is having a film on Wednesday evening at Festival Foods here in Janesville at 5:30. So that's something to be invited to. And DAT, if you're a member or if you want to be a member, we're having our Christmas get together, in-person get together at O'Reilly and Conway's at 6 o'clock a week from today. So come with an appetite and a desire to join with other people from DAT and have a chance to just schmooze a little bit. Anything else, Jean, that we should mention?
No, it'll just be nice to be able to get to see each other, to have it in person. And you don't have to register, just come. All right.
Perfect. We are at 7:01. No one has to go anywhere. I'm just going to stop the recording.
I'd like to make one more announcement before we end this. On March 26th.
But we're not ending. I'm just